Hi, we are recording this video in the fall of 2022. And that's important because through some date, like January, February, March, the market was super hot and sellers were receiving multiple offers on property, and sellers could be choosy as heck about who they sold property to. But then the Federal Reserve started increasing interest rates and the market has slowed down, and sellers don't have the ability to be quite as choosy as they would like to be. And so as a consequence, one of the things that sellers are doing that would have been unheard of a year ago is the sellers are considering accepting offers from buyers who, God forbid, those buyers have a house that buyer needs to sell in order for that buyer to close on the property that you have listed. So sellers might be willing to do things like this and have the offer contain a conditional sale deadline, which, by the way, is in section 10.7 of the Real Estate Commission approved contract. But the purpose of this video is to help you understand as a seller how buyer-oriented that clause is and how you might want to manage the risk for a seller by allowing a buyer to have a conditional sale deadline. So the concept is that there is a date that is identified in the Real Estate Commission approved contract, the conditional sale deadline, which identifies a date by which the buyer can get out of the contract to buy the property that you have listed if the buyer has not both gone under contract and closed, that's the key part, closed on the sale of the house that they're trying to get rid of. Let's say the buyer is trying to sell a house in Denver in order to purchase a property that you have listed in Fort Collins. The buyer of the Fort Collins property can bail on the Fort Collins transaction unless the buyer has both gone under contract and sold the Denver property by whatever date is identified in the contract. Well, as a seller, that seems a little bit too buyer-oriented because, for example, suppose the conditional sale deadline in your deal is December 15th, contemplating that there would be a closing, say, on December 20th. Well, as a practical matter, the buyer who needs to sell their house in Denver isn't going to close on the sale of the Denver home unless the buyer of the Fort Collins property is under contract to sell the Denver home by X date, whatever date that is, whatever date you feel comfortable. Shouldn't the clause say that if the buyer of the Fort Collins property, who is the seller of the Denver property, does not have the Denver property under contract by such and such a date, then the seller of the Fort Collins property can kick the buyer of the Fort Collins property out of the transaction. That is, the seller of the Fort Collins property can stick a fork in the deal and kill the Fort Collins transaction as being something futile. Not necessarily because the seller wants to, but shouldn't the seller have the leverage to do that if the buyer of the Fort Collins property isn't under contract, for example, to sell the Denver property, say by 20 days prior to the conditional sale deadline in the Fort Collins transaction. So that's a concept you would want to add into an additional provisions. Fortunately, for those of you who use my law firm's clause library, we have such a clause in our clause system, and it identifies a date by which the buyer of the Fort Collins property has to provide a contract showing that the buyer of the Fort Collins property is under contract to sell the Denver property. Otherwise, your seller has the leverage to kick the buyer of the Fort Collins property out of the transaction. Ladies and gentlemen, that's all I have to say on this topic. Remember, it's a complicated world. Be careful out there.